So welcome to everyone this afternoon, and welcome to our session on diversity, career planning for young people. A very special welcome to Sally Bailey, who is our National Disability Coordination Officer. Sally has an extensive background in career development, particularly for young people with disabilities, and she is a leading light in the area. She has delivered for the CEAV on a number of occasions, but in particular delivering workshops for our students in our Certificate 4 in Career Development. Thank you very much, Sally, for being with us this afternoon. We'll go through your session, and at any time that you'd like to request questions, you can do so either through the chat room or by using the protocols of raising our hands. Sally, I'm sure, will be able to take your question. So welcome, Sally, and I'll hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Bernadette. I've got to admit I'm a little bit nervous. This is my first online session, so please bear with me. I will just go through a bit of a background about what my role is. I do recognise a couple of people in the room, so it's nice to see some people back, and if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to stop and listen to what you've got to say, and I do like a contribution in this discussion. Okay, so I'll just start with just explaining the role of the National Disability Coordination Officer Program. There's 31 NDCOs in Australia, and we each have quite large regions that we cover. We work with people targeting clients from the age of 15 to 64 who are looking at tertiary education and employment. We do focus more on the school leavers because generally that's going to be the first major point of transition into tertiary education and employment. The program works mostly with networks and more on a strategic level to try to increase the expectations across the board of young people with disabilities entering education and training. I cover the Southern Metropolitan region, and I have been in this role for nearly 10 years now, and I've seen considerable change in the sector, which has been very positive. Okay, so in terms of what my program covers, we view disability, the definition as under the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992. So when I'm talking about disability, I'm talking about physical, intellectual, psychiatric, sensory, neurological, learning disabilities, physical disfigurement, and presence in the body of a disease-causing organism. So that's just about anything, really. Okay, so for those that aren't aware, the Disability Discrimination Act also covers, which I refer back to quite regularly, employment, education, access to premises, provision of goods and services, including access to government services, hospitals, and places of entertainment in the general public, accommodation, and as you can see, there's a list of other things that are covered as well. Most of my work will involve working with state government and Commonwealth government bodies. So a lot of the work is based on looking back at the signatory to the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, and just reminding them of the broad areas that are covered in terms of equity and inclusion for people with disability, and specifically more so in the Disability Discrimination Act. Also, a lot of the work involves referring back to the standards for education. Surprisingly, it's still something that constantly has to be brought back up in the education system. And a very interesting reading on that would be the Held Back report that was released last year. If anybody's interested, that's available on the Human Rights Commission's, Victorian Human Rights Commission's website. And also there's also areas where we cover the Equal Opportunity Act, the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act. Okay, so so I've got a current Held Back report. Okay, URL, please. Okay, I'll have to provide that later. I'll just make a note of that. Okay, so to people with disabilities in education and employment, just to give you a little bit of an idea of a snapshot of where we're at the moment in terms of people with disabilities. And I'm aware that the session is around diversity, but my area really does focus on disability. And in terms of inclusion, we also look broad and career development. We do look quite generally at some of those processes for inclusion in career development, which we cover COLD and Indigenous people over the age of 45, people who are long-term unemployed also seem to have to come under a program. So a lot of what I'm saying applies across the board to a lot of diverse communities with diverse needs. So in terms of disability in education and employment, recent statistics suggest that there are only 50% of people with a diagnosed disability progress past standardised Year 10 level at school, compared with 80% in the general population. 31% participate in the labour force compared to 83% of people without a disability, which is considerably low. And two-thirds earn less than $320 a week. 45% of people with a disability are living below the poverty line. This is in a PricewaterhouseCoopers report that came out a couple of years ago. So it's an area that the government has significant interest in improving. Okay, so we'll have a look just in terms of what the expectations are for professionals. Up until a couple of years ago, a lot of inquiries that I would get from careers advisors in schools would be around what sort of work a person with a particular disability can do, or where do people with disabilities go when they leave school, some very general questions. So to give you a little bit of an idea, it is fairly broad. It's not based on a person's disability, as we know as career practitioners. But in terms of disability, 19% of what's been recorded, 19% of people with disability work in professional areas, 15% clerical and administrative, and 15% as technicians and trade workers. There's some variation of occupation according to disability type. For example, 2009 statistics say that 34% of people with intellectual disabilities would be working as labourers, and 20% of people with sensory or speech disability were working in professional occupations. Okay, just let me know if you have any questions or you'd like to know more. Yes, you're right, Naomi. The statistics are pretty bad, very bad. Certainly compared with other OECD countries, we're definitely down the bottom. Okay. Oh, thanks for that. Anita's just put up the URL for the Held-Back report. It's a very interesting reading. It certainly makes you think. Okay, so and then another interesting thing in terms of expectation around employment is the 9 to 5, 38, 40-hour week that one might be expected to aim towards. It's not necessarily an expectation for everybody. Where you have people who work part-time a lot more these days. A lot of people I know are working for 4-day weeks rather than 5-day weeks. Longer hours in those days. And some people are choosing to work part-time or only able to work part-time. So I've got some statistics here around part-time work for people with disabilities. People with disabilities are more likely to work part-time, 38% and 31% respectively working part-time. So 35% of people with psychological disability who usually work no more than 15 hours a week. And 30% of people with intellectual disability are also likely to work no more than 15 hours a week. So the expectation isn't always full-time work, and this is often the choice of the person with a disability as well. Okay, so we'll have a look at some of the unemployment rates by disability. people with a moderate or mild intellectual disability. We've got 20% have high unemployment rate, have a higher unemployment rate than those with mild or moderate disability, who have an 8.8% unemployment rate. People with psychological or intellectual disability have the highest unemployment rates at 19% and 16% respectively. So intellectual and psychological disability is definitely a much higher chance of unemployment. Had a couple of questions put to me about career planning for people with a disability, which is interesting. So I just thought I'd start off with a bit of a statement around that. And from my own experience, career planning is equally important for everybody, as we should all be valued as individuals, beyond what we do in our formal education or employment settings. I work with people with a range of disabilities and people who have quite significant high support needs, and their quality of life, is, in terms of what we would define as a traditional career, may not be able to be equated, but in terms of what a person can give to other people, and what other lessons they have to give to others in life, and what they have experienced in life is certainly as valuable. Career development theories attempt to describe explanations of how career decisions are made, and for a person with a disability, that's no different. I would use basically the same rules. I get a lot of parents ringing up, particularly asking about what their child can do and what their expectations are for their future, and I always start them with the same career development theory that I would use on anybody. Starting from the basis of what the person's skills and interests are, and exploring from there, and then finding the supports that are available for them to achieve their goals. Does anyone have any questions so far, or comments? Nope. Okay, I'll move along. Okay, so in terms of barriers, external and internal barriers, I'll go through this in terms of what I've picked up along the way. Some of the things that I've noticed is disability. Well, this was the most significant thing about originally going into the industry many years ago. Disability is often seen as an area that requires a disability specialist who is expected to provide all the expert advice around an individual, and this can be seen across the board. Not just in career development, but in a whole range of roles where people interact with a person with a disability. I'm not sure whether it's more related to an understanding of inclusion, or that people aren't comfortable necessarily dealing with disability, but you'll often find one person who takes responsibility for a whole range of roles. Do we have a question there, Fiona? Did you want to say something?
Thanks, Fiona. If you'd like to ask a question, you just need to hit the talk button, and then Sally will be able to hear you, as will everyone in the room. So if you don't have a question, perhaps you just hit it accidentally. That's not a problem. You can just simply hit that button again.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yes? Can you hear me now? No?
Fiona, remember, we can't respond unless you release the microphone. So I'll release the microphone now and you can ask your question. We can hear you. So Fiona, did you have a question?
Okay. I've taught in primary schools for many years, and I've observed that kids with special needs tend to have a helper with them. They have an assistant, and I wonder whether the model of supporting people in this way, people with disabilities, starts in schools.
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I think, well, quite often it does start in schools. From experience, if a person has a disability from birth, quite often there's early intervention programs. Then there's programs in schools that will support the engagement in learning. Is that the question that you're asking, Fiona?
I'm suggesting is that the expectations, perhaps more so that the low expectations of their capacities is it kind of can begin in schools, and it's not surprising to me that there may be evidence of low expectations as they leave school and are seeking employment.
Yeah, absolutely, Fiona. It's definitely an issue. It's actually interesting you say that. I always remember being told a story about young people with disabilities when they're doing their imaginative play as small children, so that there's been some evidence to suggest that parents and people who care for young people with disability are even resistant in wanting them to engage in imaginative play around what they might do when they grow up, simply because they're afraid that they might not be able to reach those expectations. So I think it can start probably earlier than school, and unfortunately it can be reflected in all areas of life, and that's one of the points that I put down there. So I'll just go back to what I was saying about about people who are engaged with people with a disability right from, they actually start school from quite a young age. You have the parent who takes on numerous roles, but also in the group that I work with, mostly from the age of 14, what my experience has been in the past was that the person who does support the child in school in the secondary years will be a part of a team, and that their role is to support the student in the classroom, but quite often they're seen as the disability specialist in all other areas as well. So they often will play the role of supporting the family, of providing advice on post-school options, careers advice, although officially they are not supposed to provide careers advice. In some cases they're kind of left to have to find the information for the parents about what's available after school, because they will have probably more contacts and a closer relationship. So there's often quite a crossover in that area, and it's something that needs to be done on consultation and as a team, and the careers advisors, and certainly in terms of the post-school options, needs to be a key part of that role. And now to Fiona's point about expectations. Certainly expectations has been a significant barrier that I constantly work on in this role. And you get it in subtly sometimes, and then other times you get it more clearly. Sometimes it could be in a simple, something as simple as not providing access to educational materials in the classroom, not providing access to excursions. There's clearly numerous examples of not having that, the same options and the same access to inclusion in educational opportunities as other young people, as seen in the Held Back report. So I'll just move on to the next one. As Naomi's got down here, reality check can be imposed more rigorously than with these young people. It's true. I mean, quite often you do get a lot of people saying, yeah, well, it's going to be too hard, and they haven't got a job in their first year. Well, what chance have they got? But living in the area that I live in, around people who are, that they do find it difficult to get work, regardless of whether they have a disability. It seems to be something that's common with young people, and a lot of people will target that it's the disability rather than the fact that they're just young, or that their family may not be working, or that they've got a range of other barriers that are affecting them. And from what I found over a period of time is that it may start off with the most obvious thing is that it's the disability that's preventing inclusion, and down the track you'll find that there's a range of complex issues affecting that person's engagement. Okay, so one of the big things that comes up, particularly in my role, is a complex service system that creates anxiety. So people will go for the less complicated, less rewarding options. So having to really search out a job, or having to really search out an apprenticeship, or get that actual support that, you know, really push to make sure that you get what you want seems to be a little bit too difficult for a lot of people. It can be very overwhelming when you've got to stand up and say, no, that's, you know, I actually expect a bit more, or I expect better from a service, particularly when you've come from an institutional structure of a school where you've got to deal with a bureaucracy, and you've got to deal with you know, standing up and asking for what you want. I think that becomes a bit difficult for some people. Insufficient support to stay engaged in education is something that comes up constantly. I would have to say probably around September, October, and the last minute panic in November, I get numerous calls from schools asking about where this student can go for the next year, because they don't want them coming back the next year to the school. Around their final couple of years, they can see the student really disengaging. And this is a huge issue in terms of learning disability. I've seen quite a lot of young people who are obviously struggling to engage in their education, and finding it very difficult to maintain their academic levels once they get to around year 9 and year 10. The schools will often say that they know that the student has difficulty, but they've never actually been diagnosed. It's difficult to get the parents to get them to be diagnosed, or to get the additional support. So there is a huge group of young people, as I'm sure a few people in the room can attest to, that are just not receiving the support that they need to want to be engaged in education. And they're not supported to stay if it's a VCE, if it doesn't have alternative VCE structures available in the school. Also, the lack of appropriate opportunities to maintain personal development, particularly for people with high support or complex needs. I'd have to say I find it incredibly heartbreaking. There's a lot of disability services that operate in the community. While traditionally we had the institutes and people were then taken off to day programs that were developed more for people when they became adults. A lot of those day programs are operating on very, very tight budgets. I have to say that a lot of them are operating in a value base that's very much traditional, hasn't grown up with the times, and hasn't moved on. And in some cases, or in a lot of cases, because I have visited a lot of day programs, there is no continuing development for a person once they've left school. There's often counselling around developing packages so that people can participate in community activities, but I'm just, you know, it does concern me that how long does a person want to go bowling or go to the park? It's probably not a lifelong pursuit, and you would hope that education would continue after school. But for people who don't fit into a formal funded structured system such as what we have in the state, there are limited opportunities for personal growth and development. Okay, so I'll move on to the next one. Inflexible service systems due to funding restraints. So what's become really evident, particularly with some of the budgets, some of the funding cuts in Victoria, is that there are people are expected to pay full fee for courses that they can't afford. This is definitely having an impact, I've noticed, in the area that I'm in. So when you refer people into courses, that they're often having to come up with these costs. Bernadette's just asked, will the NDIS improve this? Well, I'm not sure that the NDIS, I mean, it's very difficult to say because they're not saying how much they're actually going to spend and how many people it's going to cover. For those who aren't familiar with the NDIS, the idea is to provide people with individual packaging. This system is being used by state government services at the moment, but there's considerably more packages being on offer. As to how much they will get, I don't know. But these packages all start with what one would call a kind of a career development model, where the individualised service is designed around the person's needs and what they want to do, what the sorts of things that they're looking for in their lives. So it'll be interesting to see how people are counselled through this individualised packaging process. So if you have an individual with particularly high support needs that wants to gain employment, it could mean that that person's provided with one-to-one support, but for how many hours? You know, how long is a piece of string? And you know, a budget can blow out to something massive. So there will have to be restrictions around that. There is going to be some funding provision for support in employment, and there's going to be some funding provision for support in education, and how they work that out between state and federal funding, I'm really not sure at this stage, but it's a space definitely to keep an eye out on. The website, the NDIS Disability Care website's updated fairly regularly, so I'd be looking at that space and seeing what happens there. But currently we do have quite an inflexible service system due to funding cuts in education and training. Okay, so I'll just move on to the next page. A part of those funding cuts have severely affected, I would have to say, the TAFE sector. The disability support that was provided for people to attend classes has been cut back, and I know with my local institute that people such as note takers are being replaced with some technology rather than having a note taker to come in and assist. So they're looking at any cost-cutting measures that they can, including reduction in staff and individualised support. So whether they're just waiting for the NDIS, I don't know, but there seems to be a bit of a time lag between that and what's happening at the moment with the cuts. So who decides? That was another question that was put to me, was who decides what the barriers are, or if they are barriers. So the way I see it is that quality career development for people with disabilities will address not only the strengths and interests, but also the person's what the person considers as barriers to accessing what they would like or what their choices are. So the barriers are very individual. What we perceive as barriers are not necessarily barriers for a person with a disability. We all have this wonderful thing called adaptive behaviour, and what we're used to is what we're used to. So you learn to cope with what you've got, and I think to be an effective career counsellor, you have to have that conversation with the person around how they do what they do, and be quite honest about that. And to do that, it's really important that you use a team, and this is something that's being strongly advocated also in the education department, is that there are a team of people that work around a young person with disability or with complex needs, and that might be from within the school, from outside of the school, in their personal life. It could be friends, it could be family members. Anyone who's done a guiding circles work will know that this is something that's incredibly useful, is finding out who's out there and accessing your allies. Is there anybody in the room who's done the guiding circles training? I see Maria's done that. Yep. Great. Okay, so there's a couple of people who've done that, so it's definitely worth looking into for people with significant barriers, particularly who need to access some supports and allies, and we all do it sometime. Okay, so disclosure is a particularly important area that I think needs to be discussed as well. So the reason why I think it's really important to discuss disclosure is I've actually been based in next to a disability employment service for most of my time working as an NDCO, which has been nearly 10 years now. And not disclosing disability effectively will have a big impact on a person's long-term outcome. If those sort of things are not counselled through, whether that be the position of a career counsellor or not, in most cases if it's something that's not been diagnosed, or if it's something that hasn't been dealt with by the individual, then I would definitely recommend somebody who's qualified in that area. But if a person has been diagnosed and they know how to deal with their disability, having a conversation around disclosure is particularly important. Having a conversation around disclosure really demonstrates whether a person has an awareness of their own ability and potential, and whether they're able to really truly guide where they need support and where they don't need support, and particularly in front of an employer, there's so many people miss out on opportunities because they're not honest from the start, and this will fall over at some stage if it's not dealt with. So some good questions for the person with a disability to consider. Certainly it's a very personal decision. It's not something that other people can tell you what to do. If a person is expected by a service to disclose their disability, there is a certain degree of discretion in how that person chooses to disclose that. So the person will want to consider a few questions. Those questions I've listed there on the PowerPoint. So whether that disability even impacts on that person's choice. So if a person chooses to participate in education, whether the form of education that they've chosen is going to have an impact, or if their disability is going to have an impact on that. So if the material is very text-based and the person has a disability, a visual disability or a learning disability, or any sort of text-based disability, then it's incredibly important that that's disclosed to the training provider before they commence, so that they're actually provided with the material in a format that's reasonable for them. So having a really good understanding around the types of supports that they do require and or any adaptations that they require to participate is really important. A lot of that can be learnt while they're at school. A lot of young people will leave school and not know these things. I actually spoke to a parent a couple of days ago who knew that their child was a very eloquent lady who seemed quite intelligent, didn't know what her child had actually been diagnosed with, even though her child's in the last year of school. So it's really important to get a proper, clear idea for the person to have a clear idea of where their weaknesses are as well as where their strengths are, and how that may affect that choice. Also, getting a really good understanding of where they can access the support. So we have a range of supports available. There's those that are required by educational institutes as far as the Disability Discrimination Act goes, and the education standards. You've got they have a requirement. All education providers have a requirement to include people with disability. Whether it's at a professional development opportunity or somebody in kindergarten, there's access and equity issues there. The best time for a person to disclose disability is really interesting. Oh, sorry, we've got a question here. There's the problem and the importance of impartial advice to assist with their choice. Okay, this is where it can become very interesting. I actually went to a PD a couple of months ago where it was suggested that a person should never have to disclose their disability if they think they can do the job. And I just found it incredibly interesting that the person who was telling me this was in a wheelchair. To me, human nature would have to have an impact on the way a person was treated in an interview if their disability is obvious. And I think that if I was an employer and somebody had an obvious disability, that I would definitely consider that person highly if they were able to articulate to me how their disability would impact on their work and if they require any adaptation, rather than waiting till after they got the job and then disclosed it. So I think but it is very personal. It depends on the disability. It depends on the situation. There is some information on that which I'm happy to help you with going through those questions. So I've got from here, some disabilities cannot be hidden. Yeah, exactly, they do. They will come out in the interview, and if you don't disclose them, then you can really be just creating a very uncomfortable situation for other people, where if they don't feel comfortable asking the question, then then yeah, it just creates more of a block rather than when it could be an opportunity to actually develop a relationship and teach somebody else something and make them actually quite keen on taking on a person with a disability. So I really think it's important that people have that self-awareness and that they're able to discuss these things openly wherever possible. But it definitely depends on the disability. I think there's definitely an argument for people not being completely honest and disclosing their disability to some people. There's a lot of bias out there, particularly in terms of mental illness. And I think if a person's in a situation where they are afraid of being treated differently because of their disability, then that has to be respected as well. Certainly, I think one of the interesting points in terms of mental illness is inclusion in education. I've found that if a person is honest in terms of mental illness and the pressures that can come along in higher education, that honesty is actually of benefit. They're less likely to suffer the consequences of getting halfway through an assessment and then finding out that you're not at the stage where you can cope and those stress levels can become quite difficult. That's something that comes up quite a lot with the higher education sector, is the amount of pressure that can be put on an individual. And if you have mental illness, and particularly in those years around 18 to 21 where first psychotic episodes are more likely to occur, it is a really good idea to counsel people around not being afraid to disclose in education settings. Okay, so one of the questions that was put to me was, as a professional career practitioner, do you need additional specialist knowledge to do career planning with students with disabilities? So I've just typed out my automatic answer to that was absolutely, but that specialist knowledge is being a really good career practitioner. It's not in an individual disability, and it's not in knowing anything medical or a whole range of things about adaptive technologies. It's really about personalising your approach so that you're really looking at the person, what they want to do and what they want to achieve, and the rest of it will follow. So if looking at the disability first is definitely a deficit, and looking at the person's desires first is definitely going to guide the process much better. And there's lots of tools out there that can help with adaptations and adjustments and putting on that problem-solving hat and working through some of those solutions. Now, was there any questions about that? Okay, so I've got a comment here from Naomi. Perhaps the more people with disabilities in the workplace, maybe this will help improve the dilemma. We need some positive profiles of people who are successful to provide to parents and employers. There's actually a whole range of positive profiles out there. There's a lot of information, particularly on YouTube. If you go to the Disability Employment Australia website, or look for Disability Employment Australia on YouTube, there's a lot of information. There's lots of clips around really good case studies. There's also a lot of information around there's a DVD called Beyond Expectations. If you Google that, you can actually find a range of case studies around people with disabilities in employment. So what's this, Karen? I'm a positive profile, Naomi. Yes, Beyond Expectations video is fantastic. If you can get hold of a copy of that, that's been produced by New South Wales TAFE. Oh, great. Oh, here we go. Thank you, Anita. She's onto it. Okay. Identifying strengths, but also identifying one or two focus of when they work on the work experience. Okay, so did you want to tell us a bit about your experience, Karen? If you like, you can type it if you'd like to share, and I'll just go through to the next slide. Yes, Fiona, good point. Profitability. Fiona's just saying there that the major challenge is dealing with profitability, and I think there are real some. I'll go through some ideas around how to deal with that, particularly in terms of job design. I think I don't think that that's looked at enough in this area. Okay, so strategies for empowerment and self-determination. I'm sure you do this anyway as career development practitioners, but particularly with disadvantaged people who are coming from an area of disadvantage, I think these things need to be reaffirmed again and again. As we were saying earlier on about one of those barriers being around other people's perceptions, even as you're growing up, around what you're capable of achieving. I think it's really important that that those career development meetings are really looking at some strategies around empowering the individual. Okay, so Karen's just put down here, I have a physical disability and was forced to cease employment. I then went to TAFE part-time and studied to keep my mind active. I was knocked back for lots of jobs when I disclosed my disability. Yeah, well, I mean, that's actually a really common experience for a lot of people. Have you managed to find yourself any employment, Karen, sorry? That's fantastic. It's good to see. Okay, so I think that it's from what I've been to a few career development meetings, quite a few career development meetings with people with disabilities, and so I've just written down a couple of points. Being clear about the focus from the beginning. I see a lot of people, young people coming into these meetings sort of looking a little bit confused over why they're there, and just being quite clear that it is about the individual. I think probably the perception around being looked after is something in that long-term planning process that needs to be really carefully looked at. The values of the person going into the meeting and conducting or facilitating that meeting can determine the outcome, as we know. So I think what's probably missing is a lifelong learning and development approach, rather than I'm leaving school and I'm getting a job approach. I think it's more positive, regardless of whether you have a disability or not, that life has that balance in it. And if a person's not looking at employment as an option, if they have a disability, that development is constantly happening, that there is a plan that's continued. Okay, so contributing to community and family is something that needs to be considered. How is that person actually contributing in other ways, not just paid work? And reminding the group that what is happening now is not set in concrete. I'm saying that because there's often a lot of anxiety around whether it'll work or not. If I say try something and that doesn't work, then who's going to help me? And that anxiety often gets perpetuated around trying to access supports. And finding out that you're not eligible, or that you didn't fill out a form, or you've got to go back to Centrelink and those sorts of things to hold back the process. There's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of pressure around what happens next. And it's important to realise that it's a journey and it's not going to end. We're not going to drop off the end of school. Okay, so back to the communication during the meetings. Some of the things that are important to remember is the communication before the meeting. If you're working with a young person who has communication difficulty, that you have a clear understanding of how they're going to be able to communicate during the meeting. This is not just for a person with a disability. I've recently gone to a few sessions where I've been expected to provide careers sessions for people from non-English speaking backgrounds, and I'd have to say probably 1 in 4 people in the room couldn't speak more than a sentence in English, and I had to ask them to go back and get an interpreter, even though I'd said they need an interpreter first. That it's really important to understand where those things are going to be needed, and also for the parents. If there's a parent coming along to the group that doesn't speak English, and that parent in a diverse culture is the person who's inevitably going to be making the decisions or doing all of the follow-up, that person has provided an interpreter if they need one. If the person has speech and communication difficulty, allow time and make sure that you're allowing plenty of extra time during the meeting. And I think it's really important that that extra time is is considered during the meeting for the person with speech and communication to have their say. I've noticed one thing that has come up a few times is that not to talk if that person is taking their time and they need extra time to maybe type out a message or to communicate in whatever way they find most accessible. Yeah, talking while they're trying to type the message is actually quite distracting. So also before the end of the meeting, to make sure that that person, again, reinforcing that empowerment of the individual so that they're reaching the conclusions not being reached without that person reaching that conclusion themselves. Does that make sense? Great. Okay. All right. So we're nearly finished here. So at this part, so I'll go through some of the services and post-school things in a moment. And just a reminder of some of the people that you might want to have involved in that meeting, in the meetings when transitioning from school, and certainly you'd hope the earlier the better, that these conversations are occurring. That there is a family member that has a really good understanding of the person there. If that person can have that person there, it's fantastic. I've had a couple of conversations where parents have said, "Oh, it's better if I'm not there," but the more that's known by the family, the better. Then they can actually support those choices, such as giving people lifts or just reinforcing the conversation around employment and education with a young person outside of school. Integration staff who know the students' accessibility requirements and who have a good understanding of their individual learning style. Senior school coordinator, so that they're on the same page and involved in the process. Mental health professionals if they're needed. If a person has behavioural difficulties, those triggers are actually discussed during meetings or whenever it's appropriate. A case manager, if they've got a case manager, may be involved. You probably don't want all of these people around the table with one young person, as I've experienced also. That can be a little bit daunting for the young person, but certainly involved in the conversation and in the planning. Transition coaches. In this region we have transition coaches that are based at some of the specialist schools, and futures facilitators also if it's in the final year. You want to have them involved. Contact with a disability liaison officer at your TAFE university of choice is really important before they enrol, so that they've got a really clear idea of what's available and the kind of supports that can be accessed in the institution. Okay, so now we'll go on to employment. I think it's really important to just have that forward leap into what happens as far as employment goes, just so that people can get some sort of an expectation of how that might fit in with an individual depending on their level of support requirement. So customised employment and job design is a really good strategy that's actually not used probably enough from what I've seen in disability employment services. So if we have a look at particular roles within organisations, there are some services that are doing this really well. No, I can't recommend a good employment consultant. I wish I could. And is anyone else there, if you've got any recommendations on a really good employment consultant, then you can do that, but I'm actually not allowed to do that in my role. Yeah, I'm just not allowed to. So the idea would be for that person to have a really good idea of what their skill set is, and for the employment consultant to actually be able to go to a business and say, and work with them through a job design specifically for that person that fits in well with their current team. So if a person is working in an office environment and that person's particularly good skill is sales over the phone, then they do that role while other people who are more multitask take on other alternative roles. There's lots of medium-sized businesses that can really benefit from using this model. It is a bit more difficult with small business, but if a person's working limited hours, that might work perfectly well. So I think it's probably an area that we need to do a lot more work in developing that conversation with businesses around job sharing and zoning in on certain skills. It's definitely used a lot in return to work strategies through Commonwealth rehabilitation services. and it's also used a lot by people in business enterprises to identify the skills that are best suited to people with very high support needs. Common questions around career development. The most common question, I suppose, is the one I was just speaking about before, is the long-term employment opportunities. So there are three main types that I generally three main categories that I look at. So there's your open employment, where you would just be going to a disability employment service, or you could even go to a job service if that was your choice, a recruitment agency, or just cold calling, doing it yourself. If you go through a disability employment service, there may be additional incentives and supports, which I'll go through the list of what could be available. Yep, WISE is one of those, Karen, that's right. There's a range of those. There's also supported employment. They're called Australian Business Enterprises or Social Enterprises. They can be, you can actually access those through Centrelink. They provide that information. And also through supported wage. Supported wage is where a person works at a certain capacity that falls below 100% capacity of a role, and they can work out an agreement. It's not done probably as much as it could be done. I haven't actually seen many cases of it being done with private enterprise, but it's definitely something that can be looked into by disability employment services, and it would be something I would encourage people to consider. The volunteering is a really important part of being productive and a part of employment, and it's a way that people with and without disabilities often get into employment opportunities. So that's something that and I myself have actually done in the past as well to gain a range of skills. Okay, it's funny, the lights have just been switched off here and no one knows that I'm in the office. So I'm sitting here in the dark now with my lamp on. Okay, so disability employment services. For those who don't know, disability employment services assist people who are receiving disability employment benefits. So they have access to the Employment Assistance Fund for people with disabilities and mental health conditions, and provide financial assistance to purchase a range of work-related modifications. So it's worth looking into some of these modifications, and this would be the benefits of registering with a disability employment service. The downfall of registering with a disability employment service for a young person is that this is not going to give that person, oh sorry, that's just gone back. This is not going to give that person something to do 9 to 5 during the day. This is just somebody who will provide them some assistance in finding employment. And disability employment services can come into schools as well, and they can also provide some job search training and some small classes at their sites. This is a list of some of the things that you can actually benefit from by registering with a disability employment service. Some of those things are for the employer, workplace modifications, Auslan interpreting, disability awareness training, mental illness awareness training. Okay, so I'll just move on to disability, disability and traineeships and apprenticeships, which is also another option. There is the DOORS scheme, which is an Australian government incentive, which is payable to employers. So they can get up to $104 a week for taking on a trainee or an apprentice. And if you get this PowerPoint later on, it will give you some information about where to access that. Does the support have restrictions to who can access the assistance? Obviously they'll have their guidelines around who can access it and who can't, but you have to be working a certain amount of hours a week. It has to be something that they've approved. So the apprenticeship system can be quite complicated, and it is much better to approach an apprenticeship centre to get them to do all the paperwork and find out who's eligible for what. But it would be good if you're registered with a disability employment service. I generally suggest people start by registering with a disability employment service, finding employment, and then finding out if they will take them on as an apprentice and turn it into an apprenticeship. There's statistics actually suggest that there's very little difference between success outcomes for people with disability and those without disability. So you can see there 42% of people who have a disability will complete, 46% of people without disability will complete. So the completion rates are quite good. And there's a $5,000 incentive for the trainer as well, if they have a disability, for support. Okay, so I'm just about to finish up now. I just wanted to suggest we've got the job access website here. This is like the aha moment for a lot of people to have a look. If you have a look at this particular website and go to their workplace adjustment tool, it can provide a lot of answers around an individual. So if you can look at an individual situation of a particular disability type or a particular employment, then and go through this assessment tool, it will actually tell you about strategies for a particular disability type. It'll tell you where to access adjustment tools and give you the information that can actually really start forming a picture of how that person can be included and how they might disclose their disability as well. When a person discloses their disability, they're not expected to disclose it in medical terms. It's very much more around how it affects their ability to contribute and perform their role. So we've also got some websites here. The Australian Disability Clearinghouse in Education and Training has some fantastic resources and some fantastic articles around disability inclusion. The NDCO website, the Victorian NDCO website, which is actually currently being upgraded, but it is accessible. We're just appointing NDCOs under the new contract around Victoria now, so you'll be able to find your local contact details. The Broaden Your Horizons website is a very good website to give you some basic information about what courses are being offered where around some of those transitions for people, particularly with learning difficulties and mild intellectual disability. And it's also got a section there on assistive technology. And another really interesting website is looking at the person's disability and the types of employment, which is actually flipping it on its head, and the type of employment that might be suited to a particular disability type, which isn't something that I would necessarily go for first up, but it's another way of looking at it. So I think that's all from me. And did anybody else want to make comment or have any?
Thank you, Sally. I think we've got time for some questions. So if you've got a question for Sally that you might like to ask, if you just put your hand up and we'll hand you the microphone. Thank you. Thanks, Maria. If you'd like to take the microphone and ask your question, please.
Have I done that right?
Thanks, Maria. We can hear you quite clearly, so if you'd like to take the microphone again. Whilst you've got the microphone, we can't respond, so you just need to keep talking. So please take the microphone and ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, I think I've got the hang of it now. Sally, that was really interesting and useful. I really appreciated it. Sally, I was just wondering who you would recommend I read in order to improve my ability to provide career counselling to young people with disability. Is there any author or practitioner that you think would be good to read or follow on LinkedIn or whatever?
Actually, that's a really good question. I think a lot of what I've understood has come from learning information about people with Asperger's and autism. I'll actually have to find the information and get it back to you, but I would have to say looking around a more of a person-centered approach, but actually focusing in on the strengths of the individual. I've actually got a lot of that information from a reading from somebody who was relating from an Asperger's point of view, which is quite interesting. But I don't know of any mainstream professionals that I would directly recommend around this subject, other than those particular authors. So I can find that for you and post that if you like.
Thanks, Sally. So perhaps if you email the CEAV, we might be able to add it to the member lounge with this presentation. So even if you've got a list of URLs of professional reading that might be useful to help Maria, we're happy to post that along with the webinar recording. Do we have any other questions for Sally before we finish off this afternoon? Okay, well thank you, Sally. That was a very, very informative session. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Your breadth of knowledge and your capacity to actually allow us to see how how career advisors can assist in this process has been really, really beneficial. I think that it's really clear that as career practitioners in secondary schools, we have a duty of care to ensure that our practice is inclusive and that we do start with a person-centered approach to our counselling, and that we really don't see that it is aggregate the responsibility to other people. I think that opening slide where you talked about a one person taking on the responsibility of the young person, whether that's the person that has the most to do with them, the integration aid, or that in actual fact the career practitioner has a critical role in the development of that young person in all aspects of their learning as well as in their planning. So thank you for a very informative presentation. Really enjoyed it. If everybody can give Sally a smiley face, or perhaps just to let her know that we enjoyed her presentation. Anita's applauding there. Perhaps you might like to just give us an applause. That would be fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Great. Terrific. Thank you, Anita. Now, the last thing that we ask everybody to do just before you leave the session, we'd like you to fill in a PD evaluation form. Anita is going to put the URL into, there it goes, straight into the chat room. If you can click on that and complete your evaluation form this afternoon, it does help us to plan for further webinars, and it'll assist us in the development of our programs for next year. We've had a fantastic buy-in this year for our Wednesday webinars, so we're hoping that each time you complete your evaluations, we do collate those and present them to the Committee of Management, and that helps us to keep our professional learning program interesting and diverse. So if you could just take a moment to complete the evaluation and send in that email to us, we really appreciate your help with that. Now, the next session, I'll just ask Anita to stop the recording if she wouldn't mind. Thanks, Anita.